Hello, and welcome to the Daily Rings of Power podcast, your daily dose of the latest news, rumours, and speculation on the Lord of the Rings of Power. The day is Wednesday, October 5th, and I'm your host, Harry. I hope you're having a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. I want to start this episode by apologising for not getting my usual spoiler review out this weekend. Unfortunately, real life got in the way, and there simply wasn't the time. However, what I do have for you today is our in-depth breakdown of Episode 6 with my returning guest host, Anna Maelasar. We had an absolute blast recording this discussion, and for those of you regular listeners, I think you'll appreciate the many amusing tangents we managed to get derailed by. In this week's breakdown, we discuss what we thought of our first ever battle episode of the Rings of Power. We dive deep into Tolkien's philosophy behind the creation of the orcs, and along the way, we argue about when is fan service good, before ending with our speculation about the remaining 2 episodes of Season 1. I think this episode includes some of our best discussions yet, so I hope you enjoy it. But before we get into the breakdown, we have to start the episode with a reading from the Professor's work. Today's reading comes from the Silmarillion, Chapter 3, of the Coming of the Elves and the Captivity of Melkor. But of those unhappy ones who are ensnared by Melkor, little is known of a certainty. For who of the living has descended into the pits of Autumno, or has explored the darkness of the councils of Melkor? Yet this is held true by the wise of Eresia, that all those of the Quendi who came into the hands of Melkor, ere Autumno was broken, were put there in prison, and by slow arts of cruelty were corrupted and enslaved. And thus did Melkor breed the hideous race of the orcs, in envy and mockery of the elves, of whom they were afterwards the bitterest foes. For the orcs had life and multiplied after the manner of the children of Ilúvatar, and naught that had life of its own, nor the semblance of life, could ever Melkor make since his rebellion in the Ainulindale before the beginning, so say the wise. And deep in their dark hearts the orcs loathed the master whom they served in fear, the maker only of their misery. This, it may be, was the vilest deed of Melkor, and the most hateful to Ilúvatar. I think all of you who have seen the episode will know exactly why I wanted to start today's episode with this reading. As you'll hear in our breakdown, one of the most important elements of Episode 6 was its discussion of the nature of orcs, and how that reflects Tolkien's wider views about the nature of evil. You'll see us reference this passage later on in the episode. Now, without wasting any more time, let's get into the discussion. And welcome back, as always, to our weekly discussion format. I know this week I didn't put out a spoiler review, so Anna and I are going to have a lot to talk about. And speaking of Anna, welcome back to the show. How are you doing this week?
I'm doing great. I feel like I just kind of recycle the same, thank you for having me back every week. But yeah, thank you for having me back. I'm very excited to talk about this episode. Like you said, there's a lot to go through.
Yeah, no, listen, I'm happy to be thanked every week. I'm happy you're here every week. And as you said, we do have a lot to talk about. So, thinking about that, let's not waste any time. I haven't given my thoughts on the episode overall. You haven't given your thoughts on the episode overall. Anna, Episode 6, Udûn, what did you think?
I mean, I don't even know where to start. Like, this feels like the episode that we've been building up to, which is crazy because it's not even the season finale. This feels like kind of 6 episodes of plot building, like, paying off. And I think, it's really satisfying the way it paid off. Everything kind of aligned, everything came into shape, and it was just, epic. We had, like, battle scenes. We had all these characters meeting. We had Nolwa Mata for the first time, which
yes,
I have my thoughts on. We can get into that later. And then of course, Mount Doom, Mordor, like, absolutely insane. Just it was just so satisfying seeing everything pay off, and it felt like high fantasy. You know, when you think of like Lord of the Rings, Tolkien, this is what you think about.
Like you said, it felt like a season finale, and the thing I was reminded of while watching it was that in many ways, every great fantasy TV series needs an action-packed battle episode once a season, right? It needs that moment where the audience is rewarded for sitting through dialogue, through quieter moments, through build-up, through all of that. And so you need that moment where all that tension's released. And for me, this was just one of those episodes where it brought out every single emotion for me. You know, there were moments
Yeah.
that had me holding my breath at the suspense and tension, others that made me want to, and I think I did at certain points, leap out the seat. And then, as well, one of the other big elements about this episode, which I wasn't expecting, and in hindsight, I'm not sure why I wasn't, but there was a lot of horror in this episode. We obviously had J.A. Barroner directing the first two episodes, and he's got a horror pedigree, but me perhaps just not knowing Charlotte Brandstrom's filmography well enough, I wasn't expecting it, but she delivered some of the most kind of horror-tinged sequences of the season, and I think overall where I arrived at with this episode was it felt like a payoff for the previous 5 episodes build up, you know,
Yeah.
from all the work we'd been doing in the Southlands to Galadriel and Halbrand's journey, the Numenor storyline, a lot of the character moments there were payoffs. And it also, for me, acted as a reminder of the importance of seeing this season as one large story, right? Because when we have weekly episodic releases, it's easy to think like, oh, well, what do I think about that episode? What do I think about this episode? And that's normal. But as we start to get towards the end of the season, you can start saying, okay, where was all that pacing and progression in each episode leading up to? Not in isolation, but you can see how all the pieces fall into place. And I have to say, if episode 6 is anything to go by, I'm anxiously waiting to see how they do the same for the other storylines in episode 7 and 8, because this for me
Yeah.
felt like a perfect payoff.
Yeah, that's kind of as good as the episode was. It does make me nervous for the final two because, you know, the eruption of Mount Doom was what I expected the show to end on, you know, the season to end with, kind of that being the big climactic event. And now we've got kind of 2 full episodes left. And I guess a lot of that will be, you know, wrapping up the other storylines. But I'm kind of curious to see where they go with the whole Southlands thing now because obviously you know, it's basically Mordor. So we're getting there.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, I had the exact same thought. I remember when the soundtrack was released, and I've talked about this with our friend T on Twitter about the fact that I had always assumed where we were going was the final episode would have the eruption of Mount Doom, and then we would have that track on the soundtrack, which is Where the Shadows Lie, you know, this implication of Where the Shadows Lie being Mordor from the Ringverse. And so it was really interesting to get to the end of episode 6, which I guess is 2/3 of the way through the season to, well, no, I guess it's 3/4. I can't do maths, but 6 of 8 is 3/4. But yeah, getting 3/4 of the way through the season and going, well, actually, the Southlands plot, like, I'm sure we're going to get some falling action, but I guess my question is, for the likes of Bronwyn, Arondir, Theo, was that their climax, or should we think actually that the fact this has come early means there's still more to come from them?
I hope it means there's more to come because, you know, as much as I love this episode, I don't feel like their stories are finished, like, nearly. Even in, you know,
Mm,
obviously they're going to progress throughout the seasons, but even in the frame of season 1, I think there's still more room to kind of explore their characters, especially with a lot of the stuff that happened. You know, there was one scene in particular between the 3 of them, and I'll talk more about it. You know, when we talk more
mm,
specifically about the storylines that really stood out to me, and it was, you know, when Bronwyn had the kind of blade to her throat, and Arondir was kind of, or well, he seemed, you know, willing to sacrifice her
mm.
in order to not let the enemy get the key, which I think that wasn't really the kind of the fallout of that, how we haven't really seen yet, because obviously Mount Doom went boom.
Yes. Yeah, we're still seeing the literal fallout of a volcano
Yeah.
exploding. So we've got to get through that first. But let's, now that we've talked about the episode overall, for all the listeners, we talked about this, and we're not going to go through this episode chronologically because while we've just got one storyline to look at, it's going to be easier if we break it down first into the action, and then we're going to talk about specific characters. So we'll talk about Galadriel, Adar, Halbrand, we'll talk about Arondir, Theo, and Bronwyn, and we'll talk about the Númenóreans as well, specifically Elendil and Isildur. So let's start at the top then. In terms of the action, this is a big budget show, right? This is the most expensive TV show ever produced. And this is basically their first big, season with a big battle, with big conflict. Overall, what did you think about the action? And feel free to kind of switch between, the nighttime battle to the Númenóreans arriving, whatever crosses your mind.
I think the action was really good from a plot point of view. I liked the way it kind of they built up this big siege in the watchtower, and then they kind of turned it on its head and brought it back to the village, which I
Yeah.
really appreciated. I liked the way they did that. In terms of big battle sequences, I don't think this episode that was its strength. I think it lay more in the character development that was going on like during the battles. I don't know if that makes sense. This is like, I'm a very big battle person. Like, battle scenes are one of my favorite things about fantasy. So I feel
You're
like
a
I kind
big
of judge
battle
them quite.
person.
I'm a big battle person. Listen, if you're a big battle person, that will make sense. You either are or you aren't, okay? And the thing is, it's not that they weren't good. They weren't like underwhelming by any means. And I think one of the problems was the Second Age is kind of like not a really awkward time in Middle Earth's history, but we started off the season with this flashback to a huge First Age battle. And I think that kind of really set the stage for the type of visual things that the show can deliver on. And then, I understand that it's a completely different context that we're seeing at the moment, but I think it kind of pales to visuals such as that. And of course, we're not going to get things like that. There aren't going to be like fell beasts and eagles fighting one another alongside the Númenóreans. Like, that's going to come, in the following season. So within the context, it was really, really good. And I did love seeing the Númenóreans and the Southlanders kind of come together. It felt earned, the two plots kind of meeting up in the middle to kind of fight alongside one another.
Yeah, and by the way, I totally get what you're saying about, and I think it's one of those questions, isn't it, of like, fundamentally, this battle wasn't there to be a big flashy battle, right?
Yeah.
Like as you quite rightly said, it was there in many ways to serve far more plot purposes than it was to serve a spectacle. And I think it's also worth thinking about the idea, and films do this as well, and even Peter Jackson's did this. You think about the escalation in the scale of battles from the battle at Amon Hen in
Yeah,
the
exactly.
Fellowship, to then Helm's Deep, well, even skirmishes in Two Towers, then Helm's Deep. Then you had the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. And actually, that's one of the things I always find is the weakness of watching Return of the King. By the time I get to the Men of the West getting to the Black Gate, and I know it's not really a battle in many ways, that is also a plot conflict. But I'm kind of like, I'm all worn out. I can't see Aragorn run into another
Yeah.
horde of orcs. I've maxed out.
I mean, I could watch that. I could watch that for a million years. I would never get tired.
Yeah, I know. I think that's a personal issue. I don't think that's got so much to do with the filmic nature. But I will say, in terms of my impression, in terms of my impression of the action sequences, one of the things I really appreciated was how much of it was in-camera stunt work and in-camera wire work. So like, and I have to talk about this right off the bat because, those of you who follow me on Twitter know that we got the usual backlash from the usual kind of basement dweller trolls about Galadriel doing cool stuff in the episode. I think we even predicted it last week when we were talking about things we thought would piss people
Yeah.
off. And we both said, like anytime Galadriel does anything cool, someone will be like, how can she do that? But both her stunt work and especially Arondir's stunt work was incredible. I've watched some YouTube reactions to the episode, and one thing I see consistently people saying, people who watch a lot of action and film TV, everyone picked up on the fact it's really good stunt work that Ismael Cruz Cordova, and I imagine his stunt man or stunt men were doing in those scenes, especially that one-on-one confrontation with the orc, the fall off the roof. But yeah, there was so much great stunt work from Ismail. That scene was super intense for me. I really liked the way that when the Númenóreans arrived, because they'd given us that amazing shot of the Númenóreans charging through the mist, before they got there, one thing I thought was a really smart directorial decision from Charlotte Brandstrom was then not to try and do it again. You know, I think a lot of directors would have been like, the moment they arrive at the village, we need to have this amazing sweeping shot. But something she did really cleverly was,
Yeah.
as they came in, we saw it from their perspective. You hear the hoofbeats, you see Adar come out, he speaks to Waldreg, and then you see orcs running, and then you realize you're seeing it from the Numenorians' perspective as the horses charge through the side of the camera. And that's just a great physical kind of filmmaking technique. And then, yeah, Galadriel's scenes were incredible for me. If you think it's unrealistic in terms of the real world physics, I would urge people to go and look up equestrian vaulting or trick riding. That's what I spent my Saturday doing after watching it, because I wanted to see what people could do in the real world, and it's pretty damn impressive. Then add on top of that there's, you know, an elf's increased agility, and it's just kind of like, I don't know. I don't want to spend the episode talking about all the negative people, but like, I just want to say, if you found that unrealistic, A, it's not. B, have a little fun in your life. You know, like, do you go to restaurants and ask them to put no spice or flavor on your food? Have a little joy in your life. You know, just enjoy yourself a little bit. That's what I have to say.
Yeah. My thing is like, if you're sitting there watching an elf and a bunch of Numenorians charge into battle with some orcs and a corrupted elf leading them, and your problem is that the way she hangs off the horse is unrealistic, you need to kind of rethink where your priorities are with
Yeah,
when you're watching a show, you know. And a lot of it is because I tweeted the other day, and one of those tweets where as soon as you make it, you're like, this is going to reach the wrong side of Twitter, and you just
yeah,
preemptively mute it, and you're like, that's out of sight. I've said what I need to say. I said something along the lines of the way some people, typically men, I've found, react to pretty much anything Galadriel does, anything the women in the Rings of Power do. If the Jackson trilogy were released today, you would have these same men,
oh
saying,
yeah,
"Oh, Eowyn's like, I am no man seen as cringe. Why did they replace Glorfindel with Arwen?"
yeah,
All of this, which I'm sure they did say back in the day, but Twitter just kind of amplifies everything to the max. Um, I did get that backlash, but I just kind of, it's out of sight. Who cares?
yeah.
I don't really care what they have to say in response to me. But yeah, it's very much, if this is what you're thinking about when you're watching a fantasy show, fantasy isn't for you, you know?
Yeah.
It's not the genre you should be watching if you can't suspend your disbelief like that.
I don't think a lot of those people are acting in good faith, and we won't waste more time talking about them. But I just so I'll tell you and the listeners a story. I'm currently spending some time with my family, and so I watch the episode at 5 a.m. when it comes out, because I am not mentally well and decide to wake up at 4:30 in the morning to do that. But then the evening after, I was rewatching it with my family, and when Galadriel swung down from her horse, chopped the orc's head off, carried on riding, and mounted back up, she just went, "That was amazeballs." Now, you will have to forgive my near 60-year-old mother for saying the word amazeballs,
Oh,
but on the other hand, how fantastic is that? Like, if someone who has seen a lot of films and TV in their time can look at that and say amazeballs, then I think you've just got to embrace that kind of joy in your life.
yeah, I feel like that just sums it up perfectly. I don't need to add anything more onto the Galadriel horse parkour thing because Amazeballs is exactly how I feel. It was Amazeballs.
And you know what? We should actually. I know he's not your favorite character, but we should give a shout out to Charlie Vickers, because his little stunt on the horse with where he trips Adar's horse, that was a pretty great stunt as well.
I kind of, when it comes to things like that, I always have to look away because I know it's fake, but I see like a horse getting injured and I'm like, no, cover my eyes. I can't look at it. Which makes it really hard for me to watch the Rohirrim charge, which is one of my favorite Tolkien scenes ever. But every time like a horse gets injured, I'm like, oh no, oh no. I'm kind of like
Yeah.
watching it through my fingers.
Yeah, it's funny because they also did the thing Peter Jackson always used to do, which was when it seems like a horse has been hurt, they will always show a shot of the horse getting back to its feet. And they
Yeah.
did the same thing, they were like, "Oh, Halbrand's decked this horse," and then the next shot you
Yeah,
get is the
because that's
horse
what I
getting
was
up.
thinking. I had like my Twitter up ready to tweet like, "Oh, Halbrand's just killed this horse. Like Aragorn would never do that." And then the horse got up, and I was like, "Oh, never mind."
Yeah, you couldn't unleash your Halbrand hate for that one specific moment.
I couldn't. I restrained myself just this one time.
Especially because he tripped up your favourite man as well, or your second favourite man.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we'll save it for when we get there, but I really thought that he was gonna, kill Adar right there, and I was like, I cannot watch this. If he kills him now,
You're done.
I'm gonna check out. I'm gonna have to pause the episode. Like,
The emotional connection to a corrupted elf is really strong.
it is.
But yeah, the other point on the action I'd add, and we won't spend too much longer on it because I think one of the things both of us like talking about more than things like action is characters and dialogue. So we'll get onto that. But I will also say, and you kind of brought this up, I was so glad that scene at the tower was like probably 3 minutes max, because I was watching it and I was thinking they better not draw this out, because like if you put that at the start of your episode and it re-drags out, you lose momentum. And so I really liked that it was like,
Yeah.
Arondir's got a plan, he executes the plan, and we're done with the scene. Move on.
Yeah. See, I did have my only like thought about that scene was, and this could be me being like really, really stupid, but you know how like Adar and the orcs get to the watchtower and it kind of like crumbles on top of them. Do you think that their torches go out and then they relight them to march back down? Or did their torches just stay lit when the tower like fell on them? Because it was the thing I noticed that they came back down and all their torches were still lit.
Well, I thought it was a different, or like it wasn't all of the same orcs, because like if you notice in that scene where the tower collapses, you see all the lights going out on the hill, and I think that's
Yeah.
because they get those orcs are getting crushed. Now I assume not all the orcs got crushed, and I assume Adar didn't take his whole force up there. So my assumption is it was like a mix of the orcs that survived.
Yeah.
Yes, they probably had to relight their
Yeah.
torches, and other orcs.
I just
I
had a
like that
really
this was
funny
your
image of
thing.
that, like in my head, yeah. Of like Adar just going around and like one by one lighting all of them and being like, okay, we can go now.
Yeah. Well, thank you for putting
Yeah,
that
you see, I
image in
know.
there.
I just kind of like attacked people for like getting fixated on the really like mundane stuff in fantasy films, and I was like, how did they relight all of their torches before they got back down?
Yeah. I have to say as well, I wasn't expecting the tweet I made about this episode to go as kind of to get as wide reach as it did, was the one I made about the orc who got crushed by falling rocks.
He was a good orc. I love it
He's
when they have kind of like, he wasn't a fleshed out character, but he had kind of a distinct look and a distinct personality. So when he died, you could kind of feel it, and you were like, oh, R.I.P.
I especially liked it because the last thing he said before he got crushed was "get out," and then he got crushed. And I think there's look at that orc. He was looking out for his men, and also then there's the comedic timing of shouting "get out" only to get squashed by falling masonry.
Yeah, poor guy. But yeah, that is the last thing I have to say about the action is just I think, I did say before it was like smaller scale than the stuff we'd seen, in the first stage flashbacks, but I think that that worked because, we got the big climax at the end with the eruption of Mount Doom.
Mm.
Um and like you said, the horror elements worked really well, and there was stakes, there was tension, and I think it was really well done. It felt I have kind of issues. Sorry if you can hear that car going past.
It's all right.
I have my issues with kind of the pacing of the Numenorians reaching them, but
Mm-hmm.
when they did and they kind of came together, it just felt like a really well-rounded action scene that we'd been waiting for however many episodes, like you said.
Yeah, do you know what? I actually want to touch on what you just said now, because and I don't know if people have been able to tell this from Twitter, but this was a real favorite of an episode for me, and I don't have many complaints. But I was a little bit like, hang on, we were inside the inn, it was dark outside, one conversation happened, and it was light outside. And like, I know that we're meant to assume more time has passed. I know we're meant to assume that by the time Adar and the orcs actually breach the inn properly, like it is later in the night or it is just before dawn. But like it was a little bit like, hang on, Adar just walked through the door and I'm pretty sure it was pitch black outside. And then it was kind of like, a good half hour after sunrise by the time he went
Yeah.
outside. And I was like, not sure about that. But it's one of those movie
Yeah.
magic things where I'm like, well.
Yeah, it's definitely one of my nitpicks, but my pacing issue even wasn't even with that moment. It was kind of the Numenorians getting to the Southlands. And I guess I don't want to get hung up on that because it's like it probably would have been boring if they showed us kind of every moment of their journey getting there. But I
Yeah.
don't like how it kind of went. We had a few scenes on the ship, we saw the cavalry charge, and then they were there. I would have liked to see a bit more of their journey getting to the Southlands.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Like, it's one of those things where I think, do you know what? They probably don't want the fans to obsess about the geography, because as soon as you let fans do
Yeah.
that, you're in a losing battle. As soon as you're like, they're landing at, what will be one day Peлагir, or
Yeah,
they're landing at what one day Umbar, someone is going to get out a map and be like, right, if you were in Umbar and you needed to get to
absolutely.
Mordor, and I'm just like, I don't blame them, because like I could see the comments before they even happened, and you don't want to deal with that if you're working on the show. And but I know what you mean. It's one of those things where I'm like, yeah, it was a little bit too quick, but also, how many scenes are you going to have on the boat? What are you going to have
Yeah,
people
that's my
talk
thing.
about? Okay, well, I feel like that's all we want to talk about on the action, unless there's... Oh, well, there was one thing I wanted to ask, just because I've seen mixed reaction to this on Twitter, and I think you'll be the same as me, but was the gore and violence too much for you? I know some people found it a bit intense.
Absolutely not. I mean, I'm a horror fan. We discussed this last week.
Yeah.
I loved that they went down that route. It was just, it made everything feel so much more visceral and kind
Mm.
of real. Like the realism of the kind of gore really brought me into it. And it kind of raised the stakes as well. They didn't really shy away from showing anything.
Yeah, no, I mean, like, the reason I ask is because I agree as well, and I knew we'd agree on this one. But I did see some people say that, and I get it. Like, I'm not here to tell someone that if you found the gore uncomfortable, or if you're not comfortable with that level of violence. Like, I get that. That's completely personal. But for me, I had all the same reactions. Like the scene with Arondir and the orc. I mean, I don't know that we needed that many shots of the orc goo falling into his
Yeah.
mouth. That might have been like, you could have just take a few of those shots out. Like, I got the impression it was
Hmm.
gross. But I love that we had the visceral, as you said, nature of Bronwyn's wound, of the fighting with the orcs. I liked that it felt very physical and messy, which is something that, like, for example, if you contrast with the Hobbit films, none of the fight scenes have any weight to them. And one of the things I loved about these
Yeah.
fight scenes, sorry, we are going to move on, but I love that. And I've watched this scene 4 times. Still can't work out if Valandil gets dragged off his horse, or if for a bizarre reason he decides to rugby tackle 3 orcs off his horse. Because, like, I've watched that scene 3 times, and he definitely doesn't seem to get dragged. And I'm like, is he just that hyped up? He's like, F it, I'm going to dive into these
Woohoo.
orcs. Yeah.
Yeah, I think actually one more thing I did want to mention, sorry, I keep like piling on. I had my moment during this episode where I was like, I'm so glad that I wasn't like tweeting about this on my main, because I would have tweeted this and 5 minutes later I was like, oh my God, I'm an idiot. So it was this part which was like a plot point that I actually really liked, which was when, the Southlanders thought that, they'd won, and then they unmask all the orcs, and it's
Hmm.
the Southlanders who had deserted them. I watched that scene and I was like, whoa, I never knew that orcs turned into humans when they died.
Oh,
That's
no.
crazy. And then it was only like 2 minutes later, I was like, that's not what happened.
I love this because every week we get the nicest feedback from listeners saying, you guys are just like, you're really positive to listen to, and you're also pretty knowledgeable as well. And now they're going to find out that, like, there was a brief moment where you were like, oh, they're all using polyjuice potions. That's super weird. Like, I can't believe that. Crazy.
I was like, I really missed out on this bit of Tolkien lore, but like, it's cool that they're including it. Mm.
Well, listen, in your defense, no, I've got no defense for
No, I don't think
that.
there's any way you can defend me on this yet.
Yeah. But do you know what? We can segue into talking about this particular storyline, because I know I'm going to spend a lot of time on Adar and Galadriel and that plotline. So I don't want to kick off with that first, just because otherwise I feel like we might talk for an hour. But let's talk about Arondir, Bronwyn, Theo, and we can also weave into that conversations about this idea of the Southlanders being forced to fight for the orcs, and Waldreg's role and all that. For you, what were the kind of, I mean, how did you find the development of those three characters' plot, but also what were the kind of big moments for you in terms of those three?
See, I think I'll start off with the only, it's not even an issue I had with the plot, but because I kind of want to get into the positives and, focus more on them.
Yeah.
The only time when the plot kind of lost me was during kind of Bronwyn's fake out death, because there wasn't even a moment during that scene where I thought she was going to die. The whole time I was waiting for her to kind of, gasp for breath and come back to life. Maybe it was just me, but I had no doubt in my mind, that she was going to survive that.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was my only really, it's not even an issue because I think that's just me and I didn't kind of fall into that.
As well, like I think it's one of those things where it depends how much of a kind of like TV trope, film trope person you are. Like if you're someone who watches a lot of
Yeah.
TV and films, and especially for you as someone who loves horror films, you can see a fake out coming from like 12 paces
Yeah.
away. And I know for a lot of people, I mean, I had the same thing. I was like, there's no way she's dying, because like if you're gonna kill her, you kill her with the arrow. You don't give them the
Yeah,
chance.
exactly.
But like I said, I've watched a few YouTube reactions, and there were a couple of people who really did think they'd like what they'd done is they'd faked out her survival by giving her the opportunity to be healed and then have her die, which I thought would have been an interesting route to take. But I think as well, because we know it's unlikely they were going to kill Bronwyn off in that moment. Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. Like you say, it's one of those things that I don't think that many people were fooled, but I suppose in some ways TV shows will try and play to the broadest crowd.
Yeah. But yeah, I kind of wanted to get the negativity, not really negativity. I wanted to get like the criticism out of the way. I mean, I'm very, very glad that she didn't die because, she's such an amazing character. And one of my favorite parts about their plotline was that Bronwyn had just as much of an impact on the battle and the fight scenes as Arondir did. They very much worked together and it wasn't just him taking the lead, as the elf.
Yeah.
She kind of stood up as the leader of the Southlands and she was like heavily involved in the battle, obviously to the point of getting shot with the arrow. I loved the scene where, like I said before, the blade was to her neck and Arondir, he didn't really budge. He looked distraught, but he wouldn't give up the key. And it was Theo who had to step in and ultimately give it up, which was really, really interesting. And I didn't expect it, honestly. But from a character perspective, I really like it because, Arondir is a lot older than all of them. I doubt he's seen too much because we was like a grower and then went to the Watchtower, but he was in Adar's captivity. He knew kind of what they were capable of, and he was almost willing to sacrifice Bronwyn just to contain that evil.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I wonder whether what they were trying to get at there was one of those kind of core Tolkienian themes about like the different perspectives of elves and men, that men
Yeah.
naturally see things in that shorter time frame and therefore have different motivations and different fears. And Arondir is, he doesn't know what the key does, but he knows that it is something of great, terrible power. And when you live for thousands of years, and I don't think Arondir is thousands of years old, but he might be hundreds, maybe 1,000. It's very interesting to think about that in that scene, he makes the calculation that as much as he loves Bronwyn and cares for Theo and cares for the Southlanders as people, he's thinking that this isn't something that could doom the Southlands for one lifetime. He's thinking that it could doom them for, tens, if not hundreds of lifetimes.
Yeah.
And so it was a really interesting scene. And I liked that then at the end of the episode, we got the kind of reverse payoff where Theo feels bad about giving it up. And Arondir basically comforts him and says that is what most people would do. And he doesn't judge him for it. And I hope in the same way we don't have, and I'm glad we didn't see it from Theo, but I would kind of hate it if Bronwyn was like, you were going to let me die there, weren't you? You were going to let them chop my head off.
Yeah.
Like that would feel, and I don't think they will, because Bronwyn is a very selfless character. But I hope they allow for that each recognizes why they did the other thing, even if they wouldn't have made the same decision.
Yeah, I agree, and that I don't think Bronwyn would have that type of reaction. I think if it came to it, she would have sacrificed herself anyway to kind of avoid the key being found. Though I do think it's like I said, we haven't seen kind of the full fallout, I don't think, of that choice yet. And while I don't think it's going to be oh, I'm sorry, I was going to let them kill you kind of thing, I do think it will kind of change their relationship dynamic, because as much as you might not want it to, there would always kind of be that subconscious memory, I guess, of just that moment and that kind of snap decision.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know what again, it goes back to that question we kind of talked about at the start of the episode. I wonder what, because I think we might not get many scenes with them in episode 7, but we'll get, some closing action in episode 8, or maybe it'll be reversed. Maybe they'll do it the opposite way. Maybe they'll close out the Southlands plot episode 7 and then allow episode 8 to focus on those things that we know are going to play a big role in season 2. But I also really appreciated that when Arondir had that moment with Theo, and I thought this was just such a great bit of writing, he gives what he thinks is obviously the broken blade, the key to Theo, and what he doesn't say is, give that back to me, I'll give it to the Númenóreans. He says, you give it to the Númenóreans. And I think what the show is trying to tell us there is that Arondir knows that Theo has been, if not corrupted by it, he has felt the temptation of the darkness. And Arondir knows that if Theo is to get past that, he has to be the one to reject it by giving it away freely of his will. He can't be forced to do it. He can't have it taken away from him. In order for him to move past it, he has to give it away. And I think that's really important, that therefore Theo never did give it away in the sense of as Arondir was expecting him to. So when you're thinking about where might Theo's character arc go season 2 and beyond, I think it's very interesting that when Arondir has that conversation with him, he still is almost, he knows he's lusting after that power, and he is denied a positive resolution because that opportunity is taken away by sneaky Waldreg, release the river.
Yeah, it feels like Lisa, it feels kind of like a did Frodo let go of the ring? No, he didn't kind of moment, because physically the ring left his grip, but he didn't part with the ring willingly. And I do think it's a moment that, if a couple of seasons down the line, Theo is kind of in the middle of his ring wraith era or whatever, it'll be something we call back to and, go, there we go.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think, and we'll talk a bit more at the end of the episode about where we think characters are going, because I think now we've got to episode 6, we may need to make some predictions at the end of this episode, because episode 7 might deny us the opportunity to do that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I will say something else I loved about the episode was that it built on some of those Tolkienian themes of men and elves having differences, but being able to resolve them in the face of great darkness, because it was a really small moment. But after the initial skirmish, I think his name's Treadwill, the old Southlander who got killed by the arrows. He said to Arondir, you're not half brave, elf, not half brave at all. And I thought that was really lovely, because it was one of those moments where Arondir has always tried to approach the Southlanders with good intentions, and for very valid reasons that has not been reciprocated. And I love that what we got, obviously the character then got shot with the arrows, so no real positive lasting influence. But I liked that we had that union, and I also liked that Arondir, along with Bronwyn, was the one to give the speech on the eve of battle. Like, that was really nice as well, because it could come across very much Arondir telling them what to do, but he's not. He's trying to uplift them. He's trying to, rally them.
It's one of those moments that I don't think some people understand, in that it was like towards the start of the season, when people had quite a big problem with Galadriel's attitude. And I think along the line, it paid off, because it made you so much more invested in her relationship with the Númenóreans. And now that we're at the point where she's charging into battle with them, that character at the start, it makes it worth it, because we see the development. And it was the same thing, whereas in, I think it was episode 1, maybe episode 2, Arondir kind of goes into the tavern and he has this kind of tension with the Southlanders. People were like, oh, it's contrived, they don't need to do that. But it makes moments like that so much more impactful when you kind of see the small developments that are made because of it. Otherwise the moment, it just wouldn't have any emotional weight whatsoever.
Agreed. And I think there's also something that, like, Tolkien often comes back to, that the idea you are going to have these big divides between the races. For example, the elves and the dwarves never really, for sustained periods, get past their own animosity towards each other. And I would like to say, for anyone who hasn't read the Silmarillion, if you're wondering where that animosity comes from, probably wouldn't be a good idea to start off from the elves meeting the dwarves and calling them the stunted people. So I just want to put that out there. I love the elves, but they have a habit of naming every other race with a derogatory term, and it's not a good starting point. But to return to my point and not my tangent, what I love that this episode did that Tolkien often does is that, okay, you're never going to be able to resolve that fundamental tension between elves and men or between elves and dwarves, but individuals can come together and cross those boundaries, in the same way you think about Legolas and Gimli's friendship, or Elrond and Durin's, Arondir with Bronwyn and the rest of the villagers in Tir Harad. It's the same thing. It's just this ability to look past those differences because of the positive outcome that results from it. So, yeah, I absolutely loved it. I loved Bronwyn's arc this episode. The fact that, as you say, she was fierce in the battle, but also very protective. When she gets wounded and she says to Theo, no, help him first. That was a great moment because we haven't had many scenes of Bronwyn being a healer. And so in the moment in which she is mortally wounded, the fact she's still trying to be a healer was a really nice moment. But I know you had some thoughts on Bronwyn and Arondir's relationship as it relates to this episode and this season. We obviously got our the moment we'd been building up towards the big kiss and the kind of promise me scene. How did that landing work for you? Do you think it needed more build up? Do you think it worked well? What were your thoughts?
I don't think it had as much impact as it could have. And the thing that really annoys me is that they started off so well, and it was one of my main takeaways from the first few episodes was how much I could kind of feel their relationship. I went in expecting to kind of watch them meet for the first time, and I was a bit shocked when I realized it was this pre-established relationship. But the kind of chemistry between the two actors, the script, everything just sold it to me, and I was like, I'm going to be so invested in this. And I think a lot of it was to do with the fact that circumstances took them apart. Arondir gets captured, Bronwyn has to kind of take lead of the Southlanders, but they did eventually bring them back together, and we got some really, really nice moments, but I don't think they were focused on enough as they should have been, because clearly that kiss was supposed to have this really big emotional weight for us, and it did. I felt it in the moment, but I think it could have been a lot more than it was. And this is in the same series where a lot of focus is on relationships, whether I appreciate it or not. They are putting work into kind of portraying relationships, and I don't think that has come across as well as it could have done, because I wanted to feel the weight of that moment more than I did.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think my feeling was the little conversation they had before the kiss was more impactful for me than the kiss. And that is a result of good script writing, obviously, the dialogue they have about planting the seeds. And I loved that line where, when Arondir talks about planting a new garden for them in a new home, and he specifically says, for me, for you, and for Theo. And I love that. That was a really tender moment. I think I really liked it, and I think maybe it worked for me a little more than you. But what I didn't like, and I still have weird feelings about this, I don't like that they cut to a wide shot when they kissed. Like, it's fine if you want to cut to the
Yeah.
wide shot after you've given, a beat. Have them kiss, beat, then switch to the wide shot. It felt weirdly to me like it was the show trying to be very chaste. And I know there have been some criticisms about the show that they're taking the whole Tolkienian social conservatism a little too seriously in that way. We've seen Durin and Disa kiss, and they seem to have passion in their relationship, but then they almost seem like they don't necessarily want to do that with others. And I know we don't have many relationships in the show, so it may be me making something out of nothing, but I just thought it was a weird choice. And the only explanation I had, which I think could work, is to mirror that first shot we got of them at the start of the season where they're sitting by that wall on the well, and we get the wide shot of them, and it's a really lovely image. And so then to mirror that with them rather than sitting far apart on the wall, them coming together. So I like that. or maybe the idea was that this is such an intimate, private moment on them, we're almost meant to feel like we are removed because that's their moment. But I always think that's a risky tactic in TV, because if you try and remove the audience, then you're removing the emotional connection as well. Like, it would have been, I'm sure it's one of your favorite scenes, we've never talked about it, but I can almost guess it is, at Aragorn's coronation when he kisses Arwen. Like, if they'd cut to a wide shot as soon as he went in to kiss her, it would have been like, we've been waiting for this for three films, what are we doing?
Yeah, because we've had, there's a mix with Aragorn and Arwen because, in the Fellowship of the Ring, you do have the moment on the bridge when they kiss and it kind of cuts to their silhouettes. But that felt natural, In this, it was quite a stark cut, I think. And it felt very much like, oh, they're going to kiss now. This is kind of inappropriate. Let's just zoom out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree with you on that one.
Yeah, just a slightly interesting. It might be a thing where I would love to hear like Charlotte Brandstrom's choice on that. I'm sure there's a good reason. Doesn't mean I'd necessarily agree with it, but like I thought it was a really interesting choice. So yeah, okay. Well, we've talked a lot about Arondir, Bronwyn, and Theo. Anything else you want to touch on there before we move on?
Nothing really, just in general that it was always, I think, a risk to have three completely original characters make up kind of an entire plot line because there's no guarantee that people are going to be invested. There's no pre-existing relationship between the characters and the audience. And I think, they've done it really well. I think each character has something about them that kind of makes you invested. With Theo, you've got the sword. With Bronwyn, you've got her kind of role, stepping up as the leader of the Southlands. And then Arondir is just an incredible... It's hard to make a cool elf that isn't already made by Tolkien, because he has so many. And then to introduce Arondir and make him like this amazing, he's a soldier, but he's so gentle and caring, and they're all just played so well. And I think it's props to the actors and to the screenwriters because they've kept me invested in their storyline throughout the whole thing to the point where they don't, I know they're not Tolkien characters, but they feel just as important to Middle Earth as a lot of the pre-established characters do.
I completely agree with that. Particularly with Arondir, I think you're right. I think he had probably the biggest challenge out of any of the original characters because people have such preconceived ideas about elves, and we don't need to get into the obvious stupid backlash. But I think you're absolutely right that because people gravitate to Legolas or Glorfindel or Fingolfin or whoever, they're always gravitating to these elven characters, that people are naturally going to feel almost defensive about introducing a new one. But I think you're right. I think the key to his character is the gentility and he's a warrior, but he's in the Faramir, almost mold of warrior. I do not love the sword for its, sharpness, blah, blah, blah. It's that kind of thing where Arondir sees his role as a protector, and he takes no great joy in battle. Yes, he's very skilled, but he doesn't take any joy in it. And I think that's really lovely. So yeah, I'd echo your thoughts on that. Okay, now we get on to the bit of the episode I am most excited to talk about. And I'm going to ask for your thoughts first, as I always do. But I just want to say this so that I don't forget to say it later. We're 6 episodes in, and this is not to denigrate any of the other cast. But if I were to nominate, and I was in charge of nominating Rings of Power cast members for awards, and I was choosing one of the male actors to go for like an Emmy or any other TV awards, I would nominate Joseph Moore, because I think he has been out bloody standing as Adar. So, Anna, with that segue, talk to me what you thought about Adar in this episode.
I mean, my thoughts about Adar better than anybody.
Yeah.
I absolutely love his character. It's one of those things, again, he's a completely original character, which I'm very glad about. There was theories kind of bouncing around about who he was going to be. I like that he's just this like original corrupted elf. And I'm with you on the Joseph thing. He plays him in such an unusual way because when we had all this, and I say all this promo, I think Adar was one of the most mysterious characters leading up to the show. We got barely anything about him, but the first kind of like big shot we ever got from the show was his glove and his sword, which everyone I think thought was Sauron at first, me included. Yeah. But I just assumed he was going to be this kind of tough, typical leader, villain, kind of general person. And then he just comes in and he's this kind of tender, almost gentle person. And this isn't to say that I sympathize with him because, they've established that he is a villain. He was kind of integral in Mount Doom's explosion because he kind of sends Waldreg out to finish the task. But you can feel the genuine care that he has for the orcs, and it makes sense why he's called Adar. You feel that kind of, you feel that like two-sided relationship. You can feel the reverence they have for him, but you can feel like the care he has for them. And he's not just putting on the show of they're my soldiers. I think he feels in a way that they're his children. Because he is one of the first orcs. I think that's what Galadriel says. And one of my favorite moments in the whole episode was when she has the kind of blade to his throat, about to kill him, and he just corrects her and says Uruk. Oh, such a good moment.
Why do you
And not
like that
even
so
because of
much?
how hot it was, because it was. I'm not even gonna lie about it. I saw that and I was like, oh, okay. But
Oh,
listen,
Lord.
just as a character moment, it was so good. He didn't flinch. He didn't do anything. He just smiled and he whispered. And that whole scene between him and Galadriel was just so well done.
Oh.
From a directing standpoint, the way the whole thing was kind of framed on a tilt, just absolutely incredibly done. And I just think I'm not ready to let a dog go. Like the breath of relief I let out when it kind of panned back to the shed and he was
He was
gone.
gone. Yeah.
I was like, okay, thank God he's not going to kind of die in this explosion. He could have died elsewhere, but they wouldn't have shown us that shot if they didn't want us to, know that he was safe in a way, I think. So I think we're good for now with him. I hope we are. I think I tweeted this the other day. When he was like first announced, I was ready for him to be the precursor to Sauron, the villain that we get before the villain. I don't want him to go. I want him to keep doing his like shifty things because he's just a really well written, well acted villain. And I genuinely don't think I have a bad word to say about the way his character has been handled.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I just talked for so long about how much I love him. Sorry.
No, that was amazing. And I think a lot of the listeners will resonate with what you're saying, and it's a tough act for me to follow. I think I'll start with the acting, and then I want to get into the scenes because I've got some. I'm going to get really boring about Tolkien lore and like philosophy, so we'll get to that
As per
in a minute.
usual.
Yeah, this one might be worse than usual. But in terms of Joseph Moore's acting, here's how I would describe it. You can watch a lot of TV and films, and especially when you're watching villainous characters, you know how they're going to play a scene. Like even if you haven't seen scenes with them before, or if you have, you know how they're going to deliver lines. You know how they're going to approach certain moments with whether it's aggression or coldness. The thing I love most about Joseph Moore's portrayal of Adar is that every time he delivers a line, it's not what I think it's going to be. And when I go and rewatch it, I appreciate it even more because you get to see where he's putting that bit of sadness in, or that bit of almost, he has a few moments with Galadriel where he's almost mocking her, and not in a way to be cruel, but he's got that kind of mirth and sadness about him. And he sees the almost tragic nature of the whole situation, and he's come to terms with it. I think he knows he's a villain. I don't think he is in any way deluded that he or the orcs are somehow the heroes of the story. And we'll get into this in a bit, but he sees them as having reasons for what they do, as having suffered so much themselves, that he is not going to apologize for what they are or what they do or who they are or any of that. And so I just love that there's that richness to his performance. And then, I actually want to go back to the very first scene of the episode. I loved that we had the scene of him burying the seeds and saying the same lines that Arondir and Bronwyn had when talking about that, because it's this beautiful way of showing that, yes, he may be a corrupted elf, but that hasn't destroyed his whole elven nature inside him. He still has that, what we would call humanity inside them. He has that roots to his culture and his traditions. And then his speech to the orcs. The thing I I came away most from that speech was, and I tweeted it because I'd like to send out a few live tweets while I'm watching, not too much, otherwise I get distracted. But I said, it's so nice to have a villain's speech that I was as immersed and as enthralled with. You think about the great heroic speeches from the original trilogy. That villainous speech could have stood toe to toe with any of them. And the way I thought about it was, he was a villain, but he was speaking to the orcs not only as a leader, not only as a father, but as a liberator. He talked about bringing them to a new land. He talked about removing their shackles. He talked about, being brothers and sisters. And it's just so interesting to have a villain, especially in Lord of the Rings, which is sometimes, I don't think correctly, but is sometimes described as a very morally black and white world. And I just thought he brought so much grey, so many shades of grey to that.
That's one of the things I think I appreciate most about this show so far, is that they haven't just kind of been like, these are the good guys, these are the bad guys. The good guys are all good, so you should root for them, and the bad guys are all bad, so you should hate them. They've kind of made those standpoints clear. We know who the heroes are and we know who the villains are, but he is, like you said, he's morally grey because you can kind of see the elf before the corruption in him, but like maybe like deep down somewhere, but he's obviously the villain. I just think they've done such a good job of not only establishing the villain, but I don't know, this might just be me, but whenever they're like on screen and they're together and they're kind of rallying up, I'm like, if I was there, I probably would join in. They've got the great songs, they've got the leader, they've got, like, if I was there and I was listening to that speech, I'd be like, you know what? You're right. Let's go.
I think if you were actually standing next to an orc in person, you might feel different about it.
You don't know me. You don't know what I would do in front of an orc.
Well, I mean, I think I know
Especially
what
if Adar was there. Listen, we would have different reactions to being stood in front of Adar. Let's just say that.
Anyway, the Daily Rings of Power podcast is a PG-13 podcast. Just a reminder for myself.
No, that's not what I meant. I just mean that I would probably, I would join the ranks.
Yes. Yeah. No. Fantastic.
That's all that I meant.
I know. Honestly, I apologize for my misunderstanding. But something I really want to get into is... No worries. Something I really want to get into is this idea of Adar as one of the first orcs. And this is why it's interesting to me, is because, to give a little primer for everyone who maybe isn't familiar with Tolkien's history of how he went about the creation of the orcs, think about it this way. There's two fundamental rules in Tolkien's universe. One is that beings that are alive and have a soul must have free will. So elves, which are called the children of Ilúvatar, or men, which are also children of Ilúvatar being the one true god who sits above the Valar and created everything, they have souls, or spirits, one might say. The second fundamental rule of Tolkien's world is that evil cannot create anything itself, so it can only corrupt that which is good. And what you get as a result of that is that orcs represent an almost unsolvable puzzle when it comes to their creation for Tolkien, because what he realized was, okay, if the orcs are evil and irredeemable, then they must not truly be alive. So he wrote the orcs as having been created by Morgoth out of evil and slime and mud and hatred. They're fleshy machines of war. But when he comes up with that explanation, he says, hang on, we know that evil cannot create anything itself, so Morgoth can't have created them that way. And so then we get the explanation that Morgoth created them by taking elves, corrupting them, and breeding the race of orcs. And that's what we get in this published Silmarillion. But then he has the problem. If orcs were once elves, then they have souls, which means they have free will. In which case, where's the morality of the situation in, Legolas and Gimli making a sport out of how many they can kill at Helm's Deep, or Aragorn mowing them down by the hundreds? Where is the morality in that? And so if they have free will as well, why do they continue to follow Sauron? Why are there no good orcs, so to speak? Why can orcs not be redeemed? And I know that's a really long explanation, but the reason I wanted to frame that is because I tweeted about this, that I thought that dialogue was some of the best in the show between Galadriel and Adar. And it's because of that. What they were getting at there, where Galadriel was saying they are not children, they are slaves. And he says, yes, but each one has a name, a heart. And then she says, a heart created by Morgoth. And he says, no, a heart created by the One, the master of the secret fire. And for those of you who haven't read the Silmarillion, the secret fire, which Gandalf talks about being a servant of to the Balrog in Moria, the secret fire is another word for the flame imperishable, we think anyway, which is the spark at the center of creation that only Eru Ilúvatar, the god, has access to. And so Morgoth in many ways turns to evil because he cannot access that spark of creation. And I realize I may have lost some people there. Hopefully that explanation was good. But I wanted to give that background to the Silmarillion, to this problem that Tolkien never resolved. The only reason we have the explanation that Morgoth corrupted the orcs is because that's the version that Christopher Tolkien, his son, put into the published Silmarillion. But there's definitely points in the writing of The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, where orcs are not corrupted elves. I think, and I've heard the Tolkien professor say this before, I think by the time the Fellowship are in Moria, orcs are still fleshy constructs. And so it's really interesting that the show is able to dive into these philosophical and theological questions at the heart of Tolkien. And so I just loved all that dialogue. That dialogue scene for me was amazing. I loved the moral grayness of it, and I loved how it allowed those of us who've read the Silmarillion to think about these bigger issues at play that Tolkien himself never resolved. Anyway, Anna, I'm sorry. Hopefully that wasn't too painful to listen to.
It was a really good explanation. You kind of got it all in without being too boring.
Thank you.
But yeah, I think I'm glad that they're not shying away from kind of the bigger topics and the bigger questions, because it would be easy to. Tolkien fans aren't the easiest to please. Like we've said before, with the map thing, if you go with one thing, you're going to upset people. If you go with another thing, you're going to upset other people. So I kind of applaud them for choosing to tackle these bigger questions, and I think they did it really well, because they kind of took on the question, are orcs all bad, without seeming like they were attempting to justify what the orcs were doing, because like you said, Adar seems aware that he's a villain. The orcs aren't portrayed as being good or like questioning what they're doing, but we get the question, they were all made by the same god. Morgoth shaped them, but he didn't create them. So, are they completely irredeemable? And just that whole scene, like you said, between Galadriel and Adar is just one of the best scenes in the show so far, I think.
Yeah, and what I loved as well is that what we built up to a little bit there was, and especially I think you're right, Adar is aware of his villainous status, because he says, when she says they're slaves, he doesn't say, no, they're not. He just says, but. So he's not disagreeing. He's aware because he knows he was enslaved, and he knows by virtue they're enslaved. But they're not enslaved by him, I think would be his position. And here's where I've got a theory that a lot of people said, the writers have raised this problem that Tolkien himself was never able to resolve. So have they made the mistake of biting off too much they can chew? And I was talking about this on people with Twitter, how do you land that very difficult plane you've decided to fly? And I think my answer is that they might kind of approach the answer Tolkien himself sort of arrived at, that was the orcs don't really have free will in the sense men do under the dominion of Sauron, because Sauron dominates them with his will. And I think what the show is setting up is that the orcs at the moment are following Adar because they love him, because he treats them with respect and as beings worthy of existing, and that he treats them almost as children, and so they still have that more humane quality to them. But I think where they're going to arrive at is that once Adar, sadly, we do lose Adar, and Sauron returns to Mordor and overtakes them, he's not going to be like, oh, come on, orcs, follow me. He is going to crush them under his boot with the force of his will, and then he's going to turn them into just fodder for his war. And I think that will be a really clever and really interesting way of showing, okay, here was our season 1 villain that did bad things, but was complex. wait till you meet our big bad, who is just going to, he's not only going to be evil to the good guys, he's going to be evil to the orcs, he's going to be evil to everyone under him, once he, becomes true Sauron post the One Ring.
Yeah, and that's not to say that Sauron, himself isn't complex because obviously he is, but when it comes to things like that, like he is wholly evil, and I think that is a really good way to show it because I think it's kind of come as a shock to people to see this kind of general or this leader treating his subjects, especially the orcs, with this kind of tenderness, and I think it'll be just as much of a shock when it gets flipped on its head. And I hope that is the direction they go in, kind of using Adar to Sauron's going to come in and just kind of deconstruct everything we think we know about the kind of Tolkien villain, and he's just going to be he's going to be so much worse.
Exactly, yeah, and like you said, Sauron is complex, but I always find with Sauron the point at which he stops becoming complex is once he forges the One Ring, because once you get past that, now you do have to, I suppose, acknowledge the part where he goes to Numenor, but that is in itself, that's all just a ploy from him. That's not a complexity of morals. He doesn't surrender himself because he feels bad. He surrenders because he's got no choice and he wants to bring down the Numenorians. So I think in season 2 we'll see his complexity as Anatar, but once he forges the One Ring, that's when we'll see all this build up lead to, the kind of ultimate villain. But let's switch from that to talk about Galadriel, and I guess through Galadriel, Halbrand, because I thought what was interesting about the flip side of that conversation was that this felt like the moment where we've been talking for 5-6 episodes now about Galadriel's desire for revenge is going to hurt her herself. This dicing with darkness itself is infecting her, and nothing for me said it better than when Adar said, "It seems I'm not the only elf alive who's been transformed by darkness." And then said, maybe your search for Morgoth's successor should have ended in your own mirror. I mean, what a great foreshadowing of Galadriel's mirror. But I mean, I don't know about you, but I thought, despite the fact Galadriel only really had 2 dialogues or 3 dialogue scenes, it was really important for her character arc, because I think we've reached her peak of that darkness revenge arc and we're about to see the falling action.
It absolutely was, because it was such a stark moment, because to kind of have this villain kind of in chains before you, you have the upper hand here. Galadriel, I think, knew this about herself. We've kind of had like dialogue hinting at it. She says to Miriel, "There's a tempest within me or inside me," or something like that. So she's kind of aware of this. But to have the villain that you have just captured kind of spell it out and say it to you, it was just kind of, I think, honestly, not to side with Adar again, but it was something that she needed to hear herself. It was kind of just a defining character moment, and I just think that it was honestly one of the most. It wasn't funny, but it was just a moment that I was like, it feels so. And I know she's an elf, but it felt so human when she didn't know how to react to what he'd just said, and she just put a blade to his throat, because that's kind of her defense mechanism, and we've seen that before. She goes straight to kind of trying to fight people when her defenses go up, and she didn't know how else to react to that because it had kind of thrown her off guard that much. He was in chains before her, and she still felt the need to be like violent towards him.
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point you make, and I hadn't even thought of it, but now you've said it, it's immediately reminding me of the scene in the Silmarillion where Feanor confronts his brother Fingolfin, kind of during the unrest of the Noldor and Valinor,
Yeah.
and Fingolfin's trying to have a conversation with him, and Feanor just pulls out his sword, points it to him, and threatens him. And it's that kind of thing where you're seeing that elves are susceptible to the marring of Ardor, the influence of Morgoth, and the presence of evil in the world. And it's funny because now that I think about that, obviously we had that leak, a year ago that Adar was going to be Galadriel's brother. Thank God he wasn't. That would have sucked.
Yeah.
But what I love about it is that you kind of see that way that he's not a brother, but he was once a kin of her. He was a first age elf, and so seeing her confronted with this dark mirrored reflection of her and seeing so much of herself in him was like, it's one of those moments where, not to overegg the mirror metaphor, but the glass shattered. She looked into it and
Yeah.
suddenly there was nothing there that she could do. And I love that it's then followed by the scene of her and Halbrand having that more softer moment, talking about trying to hold on to the good in themselves, because I think, again, this is all about Galadriel slowly, and this is why it's such smart writing, in my opinion. All the people saying she's been one note can go, kick rocks as far as I'm concerned. But, like, to have that moment of her, she has the enemy in her hands, and she can't get any satisfaction because Sauron isn't there, and Adar claims he killed him. By the way, obviously, he didn't kill him properly. We don't believe that. But what a lovely character moment for her to then have that. And in the same way she pulled Halbrand back, he then pulled her back, which I thought was just really nice.
Yeah, and to kind of get onto this Adar thing, nothing in this episode gave me any more clarity as to who his character is in the grand scheme of things. And
Do you mean
it lends
Halbrand?
more to the fact that he is no, Adar. But Halbrand too.
Oh,
To be
sorry.
fair, I don't
I've
spend that much time
interrupted you
thinking
there for
about
no
him.
reason.
But yeah, no,
So,
it's fine. But, no, I get why, because he's probably like the biggest mystery so far. But
but you said, like, it hasn't given you any more as to Adar's identity. But, like, I feel like the
yeah,
point is that he isn't a famous first age elf,
yeah,
right? Like,
exactly. You know what I kind of want, what I would love is if people are like Adar says he killed Sauron. Maybe he thinks he did. I would just love it if he was just lying. Galadriel's like,
mm,
"Where is Sauron?" He's like, "I killed him. He's dead." What if
mm.
he's just lying? I think it would be a basic plot point. I would quite like that if he was just straight up lying about it.
Yeah, I'll tell you my one issue with it is that I think it reduces the emotional weight of his conversation with Galadriel. Because what I loved about that was that the reason he says that he killed Sauron was because Sauron, clearly in his experiments to build something not of the flesh but over flesh, meaning obviously this is a precursor experiment to the Rings of Power, but he says the reason he killed him was because he'd sacrificed enough of his children for Sauron's aspirations. And I think you somewhat lose. Like, I mean, it's been well established in every other scene and dialogue, so it would be fine, I guess. But I like the idea that the thing that broke this servant of darkness from following his master was his love for his, pseudo children. But I would like it. I would like it if it was a deception and he's just, running a smoke screen so that Sauron can be in Eregion doing his business. But I know that's because that's our theory. But
Yeah.
because of that, we do now have to talk about your least favorite character, because I tell you what, as you said, just as with Adar, with Halbrand, I don't think I think I got 50%. He's definitely not Sauron. 50%, he definitely is Sauron, depending on which scene you looked at in this episode. And I
Yeah.
mean, nothing was more of like it. Listen, if he's not Sauron, the writers are cheeky buggers for putting that last scene in where Adar says, "Who are you?" And we just get a shot of his back. We don't get to see Halbrand's face. He doesn't say anything. He just walks away. What did you make of Halbrand this episode? I know you don't like him, but like in terms of that idea of his journey and his identity.
You know what, in general, I did tweet about this the other day. I joke about how much I dislike him because it's kind of like a running thing at this point, Anna hates
Yeah.
Halbrand. But every time I go into an episode, I do genuinely try and keep an open mind about his character, because the thing that I think annoys me the most at this point is that I can see how invested other people are with his character.
Mm,
And I want to feel that so badly, because I think from a writing perspective, he is an interesting character, but something about him, he just doesn't have me invested the way
mm,
other people are, which is quite annoying because there is this really big mystery around who he is. I've made it clear time and time again, and I think you're with me on this, that we are not team Sauron. If
mm-hmm,
he did turn out to be Sauron, we'd be quite disappointed, just because there are things about it that don't make sense. They could explain their way into it making sense, but it just, in the grand scheme of things, it wouldn't be a very good plot point. I don't know what to make of him after this episode. I still don't think the Sauron thing carries much weight, because if he is Sauron with like full knowledge of who he is, the way he interacts with other characters just doesn't make sense to me. And I guess it could be this kind of deceiver thing, but one, Adar doesn't recognize him, but he still lets on that he knows who Adar is. And I guess that shot at the end was very, very much Sauron coded, just the back of him. But I don't know. I'm still on team he's not Sauron. And, I do really appreciate how much of a mystery they've managed to create around him, because I know one of the things I said before the show started was that the showrunners, no matter how much they tried to conceal Sauron's identity, were going to have a very, very hard time fooling book fans, especially fans who have
Yeah.
read the Silmarillion, because, we look out for every single possible detail. And I think whether it was intentional or not, they've kind of put us all into a tizzy. So many people think it's him. So many of us don't think it's him. A lot of us think we've seen him already. A lot of us don't think we've seen him at all. So they've done really well in kind of creating this mystery around his character.
Yeah, I tweeted about this afternoon actually. So it was, I think, let's check on how it's doing. I tweeted it about 5 hours ago, and I just tweeted, I said, I think it's really fascinating that we're 6 episodes in and we still don't know who or where Sauron is. And people interpret that as me saying it was a problem. I wasn't saying it was a problem, to be clear. I was saying it's really interesting and really impressive that the showrunners have managed to maintain that mystery. But what's funny is in those 100 comments below the original tweet, because it got people really riled up, there are so many people saying, what do you mean we don't know? It's definitely Halbrand, or it's definitely Anatar's already in a Region, or it's definitely the Stranger. And so what I love about it is that it's got people so convinced depending on your perspective, and it's definitely one of
Yeah,
those things.
that actually reminds me. I did a poll on this the other day. I haven't actually checked the results, but I think it would be quite an interesting time to see the numbers, I guess, of what people think about who
Yeah.
Sauron is. It was a very limited, there was very limited choices, but I said basically Sauron is Halbrand, is the Stranger, is in a Region, or other. There was 1,900 votes, and the most voted was other, which is interesting because I thought I'd kind of covered the 3 big theories, which was Halbrand, the Stranger, a Region. A Region was the second most voted thing, so I think a lot of people are with us on that. And not surprising, the Stranger is the least voted. I think we're all on team the Stranger is a good character at this point. But not as many people voted for Halbrand as I thought they would. So I think it's like you said, it's 50-50. You see one scene of him and you're like, okay, he's got to be Sauron. He can't not be. And then the next
Yeah.
scene, you're like, but Sauron would never do this. He would never act like this. It's just confusing.
And we answered that question from a listener in last week's episode, where someone asked about the idea of a repentant Sauron, where's the textual influence of that? And where we both came to on that was like, yes, it is true that there is a period at the end of the First Age, start of the Second Age, where Sauron was maybe repentant, but even then it doesn't seem like he was actually willing to repent, so it doesn't functionally matter to me. But the issue with Halbrand is like, so I absolutely loved the scene of Halbrand in Galadriel in the forest, and I know I sent out a tweet saying this is a big dub for all the Galadriel shippers, and it was a bit of a joke, but some people got mad because I think I agree with a lot of people who are commenting that were saying, well, like maybe there is romantic undertones there, maybe they do have a connection, but more importantly, it was about both of them feeling that sense of good when they were able to fight for something that was right and when they were able to save people and do good things. And what Halbrand's saying there is he wants to hold on to that feeling. And I'm not saying there isn't any kind of romantic undertones. I think you can read it that way if you want to. But where I then have a problem with that again is like Sauron, as we have established within the show's canon, I'm not even talking book canon, he was the one who designed this plan for Mordor to be his realm. So him being like, oh, I finally found good, saving the Southlanders for some orcs. Like, if this is a deception, it's the world's greatest deception, and I'm not sure what it
Yeah.
achieves. Because, like, it's not like the Southlanders are valuable to him. Like, if he wants to become their king, and obviously we know Sauron does gain dominion over men, but he gains dominion over, like, and influences the kingdoms of Rune and Harad and I think even Khand, or like I can't remember if they're actually kind of under the influence of Sauron, maybe only in the Third Age. But the point being is that he wants to influence great kingdoms of men. I don't think it's actually that useful for Sauron to have a bunch of like
Yeah.
farmers. So like again, much like our problem that it doesn't make sense why he was on the raft going to Numenor. Similarly to me, it doesn't make sense unless he's just because Galadriel's told him that he's the heir to the Southlands because he picked up this dead guy's mark. Unless he's really going like full Decepticon and he's like, I'm method acting here. I'm method acting. Just go with it. Yes, let them crown you king. Apart from that, I'm like, but
Yeah.
then equally, like the fact that and I know I made that meme on Twitter that people seem to like, where I did the Scarlet Witch Thanos scene with, you took everything from me as Halbrand, and then Adar as Thanos saying, I don't even know who you are. And like their
That
scene
was
was like that.
hilarious.
But it
It's,
does kind of.
the two, sorry to interrupt again. The two
Right.
scenes that really made me laugh in this episode, and they're not even scenes, they're just kind of things that happened consecutively, was, Halbrand's clearly like, oh my god, this is Adar, he did this to me, and he's just like, who are you? And
Yeah.
then towards the end, Halbrand's like accepted his role as the rightful leader of the Southlands. Everyone's like, all hail. And then Adar's plan just immediately blows up the Southlands. It
You,
really just tickled me.
I made this joke. I don't think I made it on Twitter, but you know how in House of the Dragon there was, Damon's line about how Baylor was, heir for a day. It was like, well, Halbrand,
Oh
king for a day.
my god, he was. Not even a
Yeah.
day, he was king for like 20 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it was longer. We don't know. Maybe it was like half an hour. But yeah, it's interesting because I think that scene where he says, you can read. It's really good writing. That's what I want to say before we move on from the whole Halbrand thing, because I don't actually want to spend like another 10 minutes discussing it, because like we're just going to go around in circles saying you could read it this way, you could read it that. But one of the, I think the best bits of writing is having him say, "Do you remember me?" and he says no, and it both works if what you're trying to show is that Adar has done so much cruelty onto the humans of the Southlands that of course he's not going to remember just another Southlander who he, killed his family or enslaved his family to work in the Orc tunnels. Or you can read it as, I don't remember you because when I killed you, you were Sauron and now you've changed form, and so I don't recognize that you're Sauron standing above me. And that's why Halbrand's so mad, because do you remember me? No.
Yeah, I think the two things that I definitely do not want to happen with Halbrand are, one, for him to be Sauron, and two, for him to be like a long-term love interest of Galadriel, especially
Mm.
if those two things are linked. So one, if we find out that he's Sauron, and two, there were these kind of love interest dynamics, because I've said before, one of my issues with Halbrand being Sauron is that Galadriel was not deceived by him when he presented as Anatar. And I know that this isn't kind of his form yet, because if he was Sauron, he'd be kind of this
Mm.
dirty man. But for one, Galadriel to be deceived by him is just not doing any justice to her character. But for her to be deceived by him for the purpose of kind of a romantic plot would just kind of make it even further in this kind of disservice to her character.
Yeah, I think I like where they're at the moment, which is they both kind of feel a great connection to each other. And if you want to read that as romantic, you can do. And if you don't want to, you can do that as well. What I think the show would be smart to do is leave it like that. So that if people want to
Yeah.
interpret, there being romantic undertones, which I think is fine. Like, if you're going to have Galadriel before she's met Celeborn, like, I've got no problem with her having romantic feelings towards other individuals. Like, it's not... Galadriel and Celeborn are not like Beren and Luthien. They are not star-crossed lovers.
Yeah.
Celeborn is a dirty dwarf-hating tree hugger who lucked out.
Listen, we don't need to get into the Celeborn hating right now.
In season 2, this is all we're going to talk about, the fact that you are
See,
going to
like
try and sell me on Celeborn.
I don't have particularly strong feelings towards him, but when people pit him against Halbrand, I have no choice but to go full on Celeborn defender. I'm suddenly like his number one fan.
All I'm saying is Halbrand rescued Galadriel when she was sinking to the bottom of the sea. Celeborn wouldn't even go through Moria with Galadriel and her daughter because he didn't like dwarves. So all I'm saying is might be one might be one might be boyfriend goals, even if he's a dirty man, and the other is definitely not husband goals. That's all I'm saying.
Well, can we leave it at neither of them are boyfriend goals? Meet in the middle?
We can meet there. Yes, we can meet there.
Okay,
Truce.
that's a good way to end that discussion.
Yeah, I'm not shipping the two characters, but I just like that there's that ambiguity.
Yeah, yeah, I don't want it to seem like I'm kind of anti Galadriel having fun. You know, she's single, she's in her prime, you know, do whatever you want. I just don't like Halbrand. So when I see
Yeah.
her with him, I'm like, no, you could do so much better. And that doesn't have to be Celeborn, that could be anyone. Miria's still there.
Yes, that's true. That's true. But we have spent too long talking about Halbrand because, as I think we both agree, and I would give this piece of advice to people on Twitter: maybe don't spend all your time worrying about whether Halbrand is sour or not. If he turns out to be, we'll have to see how the show handles it. If he isn't, then that's that.
Maybe Halbrand is Celeborn. That's my theory. That's my new theory. Halbrand is just gonna one day go like this, and he's gonna have elf ears. See, that won't make sense actually, because I just realized no one can see me, so I've just done that for no reason.
Yeah, for the listeners, I was going to call you Galadriel. I'm so sorry. For the listeners, and a reference to it, I'm probably going to have to cut this whole section out because it makes no sense. But I do like the
I
idea of him
know.
pulling back, of him like pulling off a wig and going, "Some call me teleporno." Yeah,
Cinema.
yeah, absolute cinema. Okay, but I do have a segue for you because we need to talk about our last characters. So Halbrand may not be boyfriend goals, but he did save the man who might be your boyfriend goals with his spear, and that is Elendilf. And we do need to talk about two scenes because these characters had two important scenes. Elendil and Isildur. First, Isildur's scene on the boat with Galadriel, and then Elendil steps in, and then later the scene between Elendil and Isildur after the battle. I mean, I know Elendil's your favorite man. I know you're a big fan of this father son dynamic we've been exploring in the show. So am I. How did those scenes go for you?
Really well. Like I keep starting out on the negatives, and I don't know why, but this isn't even really a negative. This is just me being like a very big Elendil fan. You know, we got him in armor, we got him in battle, and the only scenes they really showed of him in the battle was him getting kind of saved. Which was like, come on, show us a bit more of like the fighting. He had this really cool helmet on, and we barely got to see any of it. Anyway, that's my Elendil brain talking. You know, I've said my favorite aspect, especially of Isildur's character, is his relationship with his father. And that scene, it felt so earned. And I think that's my favorite thing with a lot of these scenes is when they feel earned and, you know, they feel satisfying to watch because we've been kind of going on a journey to get there. Such a difference from his first scene with his dad. And we've had like a few dotted without, like throughout the story, but it just felt so, you know, it wasn't this kind of emotional pour your heart out moment, which I think would have been too forced, too contrived. They were still quite awkward, they were still quite reserved, but they danced around it a bit and they said what they needed to say to one another. And I think it was very much in character that neither of them were kind of, you know, they weren't blubbering and they weren't getting like really, really emotional. They were just, they kind of met and they just said what they needed to say. And the hug just
Mm,
felt so, it didn't feel like, okay, they've had this emotional moment, now hug. It just felt natural. And it was just a really lovely scene, especially with
yeah.
Beric there as well. I don't know why he just added to that whole thing.
Yes, I will say, and seeing as you start off with negative, I'm going to start off with the negative. I loved both of Isildur's scenes. His scene with Galadriel worked really well for me. His scene with his father worked really well for me. What I will say about the Isildur and Elendil scene, I will say, and maybe you just didn't mind it because this is the sort of fan service that appeals to you, but it just felt a little bit too fan servicey to have Elendil speaking, whispering to the horse like Aragorn does. It was such an Aragorn coded scene that it was just like, okay, I get it. I know you want to have for the listeners who can't see it, Anna's looking at me through the webcam like I just insulted, her family, and I guess I did in some ways. But honestly, I was just like, I don't think we needed like Elendil to go all like, when a horse rides into battle, it can sense that. I was a little bit like, yeah, and that, I'm sorry, that line was far too cheesy when Isildur was like, you could tell his feelings, and Lloyd Owen just was, that was like the most scenery chewing delivery. It was like, no, he can feel yours, and it was just like, oh come on, like this this is such a
No.
fan servicey moment. You know it is.
Listen,
You
here's
know
my
it is.
here's my thing with this. Firstly, fan service. I am the fan and I'm being serviced, so I will never complain
I'm
about
not
it,
against fan service. I'm not against fan service.
But here's the thing about this. Aragorn Aragorn loves horses. This is established. He has this kind of special relationship with Brago. And I like the idea that it's kind of like being, obviously it's not a family trait to like love horses, but I like the idea that this is kind of something that's passed down, this kind of special connection. And
Mm,
this, I mean, I maybe I'm going out of my way to justify this kind of parallel because it was quite an obvious parallel. Even Isildur's moments with Beric, but I don't know. I kind of like that we felt that tie-in because we all know that Aragorn and Elendil are related. Aragorn literally name drops him as he's jumping into hordes of orcs. But I
yeah.
like kind of the small moments that tie them together because they are generations apart. And I
Yes.
just like the little moments that you're like, oh, they are related and it's not just because they look alike.
I see that perspective. I do. I think my issue was, it was a beautiful moment for me where I was like, I'm really connecting to these two as father of sons, as father and son. I'm really feeling that the show did a good job building up that relationship in the episodes 3 to 5 to then make me feel that weight of them coming back together. And I felt like it was slightly undermined by like the show almost turning to me and winking, be like, "Do you remember when Aragorn talked to the horse in the stable in Edoras?" And like, I was like, "Yeah, I get it. Like, attractive, rugged man, Dunedain, who talks to a horse." And don't get me wrong, I realize I'm going to get hate for this on Twitter, because when I tweeted a picture comparing the two scenes, everyone was like, "I loved it. It was amazing. My ovaries. I loved it." And like, I respect that. I totally respect that. But yeah, it distracted me, because I don't like it when I can see what a show is doing. And the way I'll contrast it is when Isildur comes out onto the ship, and Galadriel says, you know, hoping to catch the first light of dawn, and she says, it should be visible for you any moment, and he says, "Oh, is it already visible for you?" And she says, "Has been for an hour." That for me is like a really nice way of being like, oh yeah, remember that elves have enhanced physical attributes, and if you want to think back to the films with Legolas, you can do. But if she'd said something, if Isildur had been like, "What do your elf eyes see?" Like, that would have pulled me out of the moment.
Yeah.
And in the same way, like Elendil nuzzling the bloody horse and speaking in Sindarin to him. And I'm not even going to get into why Sindarin appeared in this episode out of nowhere. Mystery to me. But sorry, I've got so off topic. I want to say I really love
No,
these
no, no.
scenes.
Yeah. I do agree with you and I think it very much depends on when it comes to fan service, it is essentially, are you the fan that's being serviced? And if it comes
Yeah.
to an Aragorn parallel, I am absolutely never going to have a problem with it. So, and you know what? You know for a fact that I'm going to go away now and tweet about this just to irritate you.
I know you are. I know, because we hung out in London, and while we were meant to be having a nice drink talking, you were busy tweeting about Aragorn. So it's fine. It's fine. I'll send you the tweet I did, so I can prove at least that I'm not just a hater.
Okay.
But yeah, what I will say is that I was listening, or I was watching the inside the episode video that Prime Video puts up for each of his episodes, and what I found really interesting was Maxime Baldry was talking about his portrayal of Isildur, and he was saying, we do talk about it as him being a rebellious son, but he's also rebelling through not rebelling in many ways. He's trying to live up to his father. And I think we saw that again in this episode where, he's up with Miriel and her guard, and he's restless, and she sees that and she's like, well, what's another soldier to throw into the mix? But for him, it's like he wants to live up to his father. And I like that we saw that. And then we had the counter to that, which was Isildur recognizing the mutual pain in his father over his mother's loss. and wanting to
Yeah.
grow that bond through something his mother taught Elendil. So I really love that scene. I don't want to pretend that I didn't. I thought it was a really humane moment that I really enjoyed.
Yeah, and not to be, I know I'm gonna say something nice about Halbrand here, but like rewind a few episodes, and I was talking about the kind of pacing of Isildur's plot, and I didn't like that they
Yeah.
just kind of got him to save a life. Elendil saw it happen, and he was like, "Oh, you can come with us now." What I was really worried that they were gonna do was send Isildur into the battle, and I thought he was gonna be the one to save Elendil. You know, when he was kind of getting
Yeah.
ambushed. So I'm glad that it was actually Halbrand who ended up doing it, because I think that would have just been too on the nose. You know, Isildur finally gets to go into battle and he saves his father's life.
Yeah, no, I agree. I liked that subversion of expectations a lot, and I will say, I know we've moved past Halbrand, but it's very funny to me that if Halbrand is Sauron, that he saves Elendil's life, the man who is later going to kill him. You know, bit of dramatic irony there. Also, maybe a bit stupid, so hopefully, he isn't Sauron. Okay, I think that covers pretty much everything from me on a character standpoint. Is there anything you want to cover before we go to final thoughts and rating the episode?
I don't think so. The only other kind of character who did something notable was, I guess, Waldreg. He's hilarious. He's just a bit of a
Yeah.
nuisance, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, I like him. He's just an irritating old bloke who wants to be involved. I love that. I will say, I love
Yeah.
that he brought up Sauron again when he saw the carving of Sauron. He was like, "Pardon me, Lord Father, but what did happen to Sauron?" And you're like, "Really? You got chokeslammed last time you mentioned him. Can you not just like, you're on a mission. Just zip the lip."
Maybe that's why. Maybe that's why he mentioned him again.
Yeah, maybe.
He wanted a repeat.
Oh, I realize what you're saying. We're doing this
Yeah.
again, are we? We're doing this again. Okay. Right. Anyway, well,
Moving swiftly on.
moving. Yeah, I wish I'd seen it coming. Otherwise, we would have moved right past it. Okay. Yeah, and I know we haven't talked about Mount Doom exploding, but like, what are we gonna say? It was amazing. It was cool. I loved it. Blew my mind. Blew the mountain.
Yeah, what I really, really liked was that it was kind of, there was obviously this kind of magical element to it, but it was more scientific. You know, it was this kind of key that led to this contraption to kind of
Mm,
to make Mount Doom explode, which was, I think, a really interesting way to do it. And just, it was one of those moments like, the Great Wave episode, the beginning with obviously the
yes.
wave. It was one of those moments where you can just feel the budget. You realize
Yeah.
that this is, you're like, you watch it and you're like, okay, yes, this is the most expensive TV show ever made.
Yeah, and like visually, it was spectacular. And your point, two things I like about that more scientific explanation is one, it's actually a very Sauron thing to do. Like people forget that Morgoth's mode of ruling is much more kind of magical, and that kind of because he is a Valar, it's that much more power of will and almost magical power. But Sauron is someone who very much rules through the machine, and I know Tolkien has the whole thing about man and machine and magic. We won't get into that now, and that's where the ring plays into it. But I like that there was that mechanical aspect. And the other thing I liked was that as soon as I tweeted about it, I had like 3 geologists in my replies being like, "That's actually a real way explosions happened. It's so cool that they did that." And someone who asked one of our listeners, I think his username is Artenaro GG, is a geologist, and they wrote a great thread about how these explosions could happen, and it's all to do with obviously the kind of instant vaporization of steam and the pressure. But I'll link that in the show notes if anyone wants to take a look. But I just want to say how cool it is that one of our listeners is a geologist who is then able to explain how Mount Doom exploded in real world terms, and that might be the coolest thing that's happened to me since I started this podcast.
Yeah, you'll have to send that thread to me because I don't think I've seen it. But yeah, it was just that shot of Galadriel when she's just kind of standing there, it pans to behind her. You've got this kind of lightning, you've got the
Yeah.
redness, and it just it's so crazy to me that one of the first promotional shots we ever had of Galadriel was the explosion of Mount
Yes.
Doom. Like, would any of us have ever guessed?
Do you know what? The funny thing is, though, before the season started, I was like, because I think I put that thread together of all the promotional material we'd had over the last year and a half, and I went back through the Vanity Fair and looked at the articles, and I thought it is strange that she's in a village and there appears to be fire in the background. I'm like, but she's walking
Yeah.
quite casually, she's not in a rush, she's like strolling down. And it's like interesting to then see how that shot evolved into the
Yeah.
final thing. So I think that's super cool. But yeah, Mount Doom erupting, super cool. Can't wait to see the aftermath of that. But we have been going for quite a while, so let's approach ending thoughts because we need to do a bit of speculation as well. Anna, what are your closing thoughts on the episode? And I don't know how you're going to rate this one, actually. I have no idea at all. So, Anna, what are your thoughts and what's your rating for the episode?
It was just an incredible episode, It felt so Tolkien, it felt so Lord of the Rings, it felt just like what you think when you think of a big budget fantasy show. It was just incredible, and it really showed kind of the payoff of just focusing on one plot line because it felt so coherent. The character moments were great, and it was just an amazing episode. And I think overall I would give it a 9 because as much as I loved it, episode 3 and 4 are still my favorites overall.
Okay. I completely understand that reason. I think I'm very similar. So I agree with you. I think it was excellently executed. I think it was where the show, kind of finally delivered some payoff for the Southlands plotline, for Galadriel, for Numenorians, for Adar. So wins points for that. Wins points for excellent fight choreography, practical stunts. Then the VFX of Mount Doom exploding, the charge through the woods with Nolwa Matar playing, and I know we haven't talked about it. Yes, I agree. Nolwa Matar should have been used for something more epic, but I liked it and I got to hear it, so no one's taking that away from me. How would I rank it? So I think the best ranking I've given to an episode so far was episode 2, which I gave 9. I'm going to give this a 9 as well. And
Ah,
I'm not saying this is my favorite episode, but it kind of is. The only reason I can't give it favorite episode is because it is not fair to evaluate an episode which has to juggle 3 different plot lines or 4 different plot lines with an episode that has to juggle 1 plot line. Like, they're just 2 very different things. Most of my quibbles about this episode, as we've talked about all the way through, really small. Like, if I was being super generous, I'd give it a 9.5, but then I would be saying that it's my favorite episode of the season. And I think that you have to grade on a curve a little bit, and I think battle episodes, for me, that was a perfect one storyline episode, but it's not a perfect episode of the Rings of Power for me, because, like, for me, while I and I know I've said in the past, I like episodes where they bring it down to 2 storylines or 3. One storyline is not quite as much for me, and I know technically Numenorians, Galadriel, Southlands, it's 2 plots coming together. But for me, this episode is up there with episode 2 for me. It's probably my joint favorite episode. Maybe I won't say favorite, but for me, joint favorite episode.
yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so I want to do some fun predictions. Maybe fun's the wrong word, and then I want to get into some speculation for the end of the season, and we'll just do 5-10 minutes on that because and I apologize to listeners, we didn't have time to take questions, but we took like 30 questions last week, so we'll take questions again for episode 7. There'll be more to talk about because of multiple plot lines. This was a battle. I don't know what your questions would be anyway. Hopefully we answered them without even getting them. But okay, Anna, here's my first question for you: dead or alive, Valandil and Ontimo?
I think Ontimo is going to die solely because one of them was bound to die. They're Isildur's friends. They have kind of targets on their head plot wise. And it was for the fact, it was kind of an offhanded joke, but Isildur and is it Valandil were joking,
Mm-hmm.
Ontimo has seen enough of war. If I'm getting the two friends their names right,
No,
because
no,
I
you got it
kind of
right.
mix
Yeah,
them
yeah.
up in my head. Yeah. They say he's seen too much of war and he's like, oh yes, for a lifetime. I was like, oh poor you. You're
Yeah.
going.
Okay, I'm going to disagree. I'm going to say Valandil dies, and that's the irony: is that Ontimo has seen enough war for a lifetime, but he survives, and Valandil, who wanted to be this heroic warrior and was enjoying the whole experience, dies. I'm also biased because I know that Isildur names one of his sons Valandil, and so I'm assuming
Yeah.
Valandil's dying before he has any sons. But who knows? Maybe Valandil is going to survive this season and die in a later one, which would perhaps be more emotionally impactful.
Maybe we should make a bet. If we both think each one's gonna die, we should make a bet on who's gonna die first.
Okay, we can make a bet. And what are we betting for?
I have no idea. We can figure that out. We can figure out the details later.
For listeners, I'll tweet out what our bet's going to be once we work it out. We'll
Okay.
have a think. Maybe one of us gets to write a tweet for the other's account and they have to send it.
That's a good idea. That's okay. We can bet for that.
Okay, so you've got to hold us to this, guys. Whichever. If Valondil's dead, I'm writing Anna's tweet. If Ontomo's dead, Anna's writing mine. Okay. Do any of the other named characters that we saw, so I'm thinking the trio of the Southlanders, Halbrand, Galadriel, or Miriel, Elendil, Isildur, I obviously don't think any of them are dying in the explosion, but are any of them getting badly injured, wounded, anything like that?
I want to say yes, purely for the stakes, but honestly, I don't think so. I think we kind of had the death scare with Bronwyn, and I don't think they would do that again because, there's no point we've been there. What was that face for? You disagree, don't you?
I know I've got a real crack theory. So we
Oh,
don't
okay.
we don't see Adar at the end of the episode. He's disappeared. The last shot we see of Bronwyn and Rondir is them both calling for Theo. What if Adar takes Theo during the confusion, and so he's not necessarily injured, but he's captured by Adar?
Oh, that's interesting, but what would be like the reason for him taking him, if not for the fact that he was the one who had the key?
I don't know. It's a
Just
crack
general
theory. I don't.
mischievous, just general
Yeah,
villainous things. He sees a little child and he's like, "Okay, you're coming with me."
yeah. I think you'll find I've seen quite a few Disney films in my time, Anna. I know how villains work. They kidnap children.
General villainy. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Scum and villainy. Adar's going to do it. No, I think it's unlikely, but I also wouldn't be surprised if we see Miriel get injured because I'm interested to see how they're going to lead this season into her being challenged in her, power and authority by Farazon. So it'd be really interesting if she sustained an injury that maybe made her bedridden or something like her father for a while. Like, it
Yeah.
wouldn't have to be a permanent injury. So that's a theory, but I don't know. Okay, and then let's talk about some more general. Have you watched the episode 7 trailer?
No, I've got to the point where I want to go in completely blank. The promos give too much away for me that I can't watch them anymore.
Okay, well, I've seen them, so I won't spoil anything for you. But just fine then.
Thank you.
What are you hoping to see in episode 7? What do you think you might see? Thoughts and expectations for episode 7?
I'm gonna sound like you right now. We need more Celebrimbor, and we need a
Ah,
lot more of him.
yes,
We
yes.
have
Come
we
on,
have
Anna.
2 episodes left of the season, and we need more of him before the season ends. I think he's my main one in episode 7. I need more Celebrimbor.
Celebrimbor Breakfast Club, bring him back. That's what I'm saying. Yes, I'm still thinking about creating a Twitter community or group where Celebrimbor fans can come together and it could be like our support group because we've been so maligned by this season. I would love to see more Celebrimbor. Do you know the really sad thing is though? I'm the big Celebrimbor fan, and you're the one being like, I hope we see more of it. I've just accepted we're not going to. I'm just like in a place mentally where I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm not going to get to see him, am I? They're going to save him for episode 8, aren't they? Like, I'm just not going to get to see him.
Yeah, to be fair, as long as you don't get your hopes up, you won't be too disappointed. Yeah, I think Celebrimbor is the main person I want to see. If there's a plot line I could choose to go back to for this episode, it would be the Harfoots because I love the Stranger plot so far, but
Mm.
I think it's the fact that we're so close to the end of the season now. I'm getting more and more nervous about how all these other plot lines are going to kind of wrap up because we are no closer to knowing anything about the Stranger as we were at the start of the season. We got introduced to the Mystics, but for maybe 2, 3 shots, we don't know
Yeah.
anything about them, the Stranger. So how they're going to kind of resolve that in a way to wrap it up, is it like season wise in 2 episodes? I don't know.
Yeah, I think the Mystics are a big concern for me. Like, you were absolutely on the money with your prediction that Adar being introduced in episode 4 wasn't going to be an issue because he was going to be so good. I mean, you knocked that prediction out the park, so true. But I'm worried that your other prediction may have been right, that leaving the Mystics this late was going to be a mistake. Now, caveat once again, if they are a multi-season character, that's cool. That's fine. Got no problem with that. But I don't know why, if they are going to be important, why we've had to wait this long. So, concern there, I guess.
Yeah, I guess if they are there to kind of drive the stranger's plot, it would make sense to just kind of throw them in to, kind of enhance this mystery, maybe give us a few clues as to who he is. But if they're
Mm,
going to kind of play this big role, I don't think they could condense that into one season at this point. They're either going to have to be a two-season thing, so they're either going to be important in the grander scheme of things, or I don't think they're going to have too much impact on the story, like whatsoever.
no, I think you're probably right on that. It could just be a case of them being a catalyst film. I'll say the other storyline I do expect to see, and I'm very interested to see what they do with it, because they've done a lot of great stuff with it in the first 5 episodes. So I'm actually kind of curious what they can even do in the last two episodes that'll feel satisfying, which is the Elrond and Durin storyline. Fascinated by what they're going to do with that. Obviously, we know Elrond's gone back with Durin to try and convince his father to give them the Mithril. I think they're going to be successful, but I'm sure it's not going to be easy, and I'm very interested to see how that plays out next episode.
Yeah, because I feel like we've kind of followed a pattern with them. We had Elrond going to him, mending their relationship, swearing the oath. We had the fear like, oh no, he's going to break the oath, but they kind of subverted that. They
Mm.
maintain their friendship. I don't think they're going to kind of destroy that friendship before the end of the season. I'd be very disappointed if they did. But yeah, I don't know. I think that's the plot line that
Mm.
they could wrap up like the tidiest, because it's not going to be left on this huge cliffhanger. I guess there's no real mystery surrounding it, I guess, unless you take into account this, where the elves got this mithril story from. That's
Yeah,
still a bit
yeah.
of a thing, which kind of, sorry, not to kind of segue into this big thing, but my main, and I'm going to be more general about the final 2 episodes, not just episode 7. I don't want to come out of season 1 not knowing who Sauron is. And I
Agreed.
think this might just be me as an impatient person, but I cannot wait for like maybe 1, 2 years to find out who he is. And I think that's my biggest thing now, because we're on episode 7 basically, and I have absolutely no idea. It could be any which way, but I would really appreciate a reveal. But there's so much riding on it. If the Sauron reveal isn't good, so many people are going to be like,
Yeah, that's what I tweeted about today. I said, like, I think it's a good thing this mystery has been so compelling and got people talking. Like, I think it was a really smart decision. But the trouble you have when you make a fandom theorize and speculate for, a whole season of TV, if your conclusion isn't satisfying for, I'm not even gonna say the majority, but like a plurality, like a good 40%. If your conclusion isn't satisfying for like a good chunk of the fandom, you're gonna struggle, and
yeah,
that's why but I think that you don't need to worry about them not showing us Sauron. I'm absolute like my theory is, if they're not going with our theory that Anatar is already in Eregion, if they're not going with that, then we'll definitely find out who he is, because whoever Sauron is going to be revealed as Sauron. And
yeah,
if they do the Anatar theory, then we'll know because Anatar will show up. So I think one way or another
yeah.
we'll get an answer. But my only question is there a chance we find out next episode and have the falling action from it in the finale?
I don't think so. And the only reason that I'm saying that is because obviously I assumed that Mount Doom's explosion was going to be the big finale. And so if they've put that in episode 6, then episode 8 surely has to be the Sauron reveal, because I guess that's the only thing that could kind of upstage that as the climax of the show.
Yeah, do you know what? It's just occurred to me something that's really worrying me, that I assume Galadriel's not going to stick around in the Southlands now, I don't think, because as far as she's concerned, Sauron isn't there. I don't think she's going to care about hunting down Adar. Now that she knows that Sauron isn't there, I don't think she's going to stick around. So here's my big worry. And it's not really a big worry, because like I said, I'll accept it if they give a good explanation. But here's my big worry, that Galadriel leaves the Southlands, Halbrand stays behind, Halbrand goes off to confront Adar, and it's revealed as Sauron. End of season.
Yeah.
That's my worry.
That would just feel cheap, I think, in my opinion. I just would not like that.
Again, like, if they execute it well, because like I never want to be one of these people that's like, I wouldn't accept it if they do that, because like I don't want to be the kind of viewer who's like, if they don't do it my way, I'm not going to like it. But all I'm saying is I think that's a much more challenging reveal. Now, it's probably not a challenging reveal for people who haven't read the books. Like, I've talked to people who haven't read the books. A lot of them don't think anything's up with Halbrand. A lot of them are just like, oh, he's a bit of an Aragorn character. But I think it will be very hard to make that satisfying for book readers en masse. So it's about which way they'd like to go with that, I guess.
Yeah. See, my main thing with Sauron, and this is going to seem like a very strange comparison, but I will explain it. How familiar are you with the kind of lore, I guess, around Pretty Little Liars? Not familiar.
What kind of question is that?
Listen, it will make sense when I explain it.
I've never been more confused by a question in my life. Are you familiar with the lore around Pretty Little Liars? You might as well have asked me, am I familiar with the physics of, like, the Chronicles of Narnia? Like, no, I don't know. What are
Okay,
you talking
listen, all you needed to say was no. The attitude. Okay, so
I know.
So here's the thing. I was like a huge Pretty Little Liars fan. I was a teenage girl when it was on. It was like a huge thing for me, and I watched it as it aired. So I kind of followed the seasons as they came out. And the big thing was there's this kind of character, no one knows who they are, and they're called A. And every season kind of goes on, someone's revealed as A, but it turns out that they're not like the real A. There's kind of someone controlling it at the top, and you never know who it is until the final episode of the final season, when they decided to create an original character and they made them the long lost British twin of one of the main characters who was getting targeted by A. And everyone just gave up with the show. It was not well received. You watched that moment and you felt like you'd just wasted kind of 5 years of your life watching a TV show for no reason, because they'd put no thought into the reveal. They'd put no kind of effort into it, and it felt like you'd wasted that much of your time. And like I said, it's a weird comparison, but I don't want something like that to happen with Sauron, where they're like, okay, we don't know how to kind of make this reveal happen, so we're just going to make this random person Sauron.
Would Halbrand be that bad for you? Because you just described something which sounds like a betrayal of fans who dedicated like 5 years to a TV show or however long. We're talking about
Halbrand
8 episodes.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like, Halbrand wouldn't be that bad, but if it was like, if they don't reveal Sauron now, we were waiting kind of years for this reveal. They're putting so much pressure on themselves. They're putting so much pressure on themselves to make this reveal worthwhile. And the reason, not to go back to Pretty Little Liars, but the reason that they did that was because people had theorized who A was going to be so much that they didn't want to make it someone who people thought it was going to be, if that makes sense. So they kind of plucked out this completely original character. And that's my fear, if they kind of drag on this Sauron reveal, that the theories are going to get so kind of outlandish that they're going to really struggle to put him into the story.
Yeah, I mean, we've already had people who haven't read the book saying, like, is Celebrimbor Sauron? Which, like, to be fair, is actually quite a clever take. When you, like, I know people have laughed at them, but that's a genuinely smart take from people who haven't read the books, because they're like, hang on, I know Sauron forges the rings. I've been introduced to this guy who's talking about forging things, and they've kept him off screen a lot because they hate Harry and don't want to give him their favorite character. But yeah, no, I agree with you. Like, I think it would be a huge mistake not to reveal it until season 2. You saying that has actually made me wonder, if the Anatar theory is what they go with, I wonder if that doesn't land that well for non-book readers. Because, like, obviously we know from the books and the way Tolkien writes, he doesn't say, like, And then a guy called Anatar turned up, and he was really nice. He just goes, and then Sauron came to the elves in his fair form as Anatar. So, like, you're in on the joke. And so if they reveal Sauron as Anatar, they need a way of telling book readers that the guy they introduce in episode 8 called Anatar is Sauron. Like, that's the issue. Like, I think some book readers think, like, it should be a mystery for show-only viewers, but it absolutely shouldn't. Like, when they introduce Anatar, they also need to clue viewers in that this is Sauron, because otherwise it doesn't work.
Exactly, because, you know, if you're not someone who kind of has this pre-existing knowledge of who he is, Anatar's going to be introduced. You'll get like a few episodes down the line, and when there's like kind of this big reveal of his deception and all of this, it's going to feel, for someone who doesn't know who Anatar is, it's going to feel like you've just kind of chosen someone at random to be the villain, basically.
Yeah. Which I think leads me to believe, if they do go the Anatar route, which again, it's the one we're both most in favor of, I hope they do it, I think the way they have to end the season is with Anatar not only be revealed, but be talking to Celebrimbor about forging rings. And that's the main reason why I don't think Halbrand is Sauron. I've got other reasons, but in terms of like ending the season, we know they've built this forge thing up and the Mithril thing up. There's no real way to end that plotline in a satisfying way in Eregion and in Lindon if you don't have the reveal that Celebrimbor's plan through Anatar is to make rings. So, like, that's why I don't think it can work, because, like, if Halbrand is in the Southlands, like, how can he also be... Anyway, we're just going around in circles at this point, but do you know what I mean? Like, I think there needs to be a way to have... Like, you can't have a show called The Rings of Power and get to the end of season 1 and no one's mentioned a damn ring, because people are going to be like, why is the show called The Rings of Power?
Yeah, because that's what that entire plotline is kind of building up to. It would be the best possible way to leave it. You know, Sauron doesn't even have to kind of mention the Rings of Power, but you just kind of have to allude that that is what season 2 is gonna... Because I think season 2 obviously is going to be the forging of the rings.
Yeah,
we need that indication.
Yeah, I don't necessarily need him to say, "Hey, Celebrimbor, have you considered making rings of power?" And then he smiles into the camera. Yeah. Exactly. I don't need that, but what I do need is like him to say, like, together we can craft objects that, you know, can preserve and blah blah and grant great power. Like, he doesn't need to say rings, but he needs to, like, this idea of crafting. So jewelry of power. Hey, Celebrimbor, have you considered jewelry of power? We don't need to decide what it is. Can be earrings, can be bracelets. We'll find.
Yeah, we'll do some workshopping.
Exactly. Okay, well, we have gone completely off the rails. We've done improv on Sauron and Celebrimbor. We've talked about Pretty Little Liars. Anna and I have made a bet, and we've insulted each other's fan service moments. So I'm going to call that a really good episode.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, Anna, thank you so much as always for joining me. Once again, apologies to listeners, I didn't put out my short spoiler review, so thank you to anyone who does listen to these longer episodes. I know it's a lot more time commitment, and something I'm going to try and do is add timestamps. So if you're looking for particular topics, scenes, you can skip to those moments as well. So have a look for those in the show notes. But to close, Anna, thank you so much for joining me. Today was a blast. We had a great time. What message would you like to leave with the viewers this week?
I would like to leave that 2 episodes left. I am going to try my best to appreciate Halbrand as we get to the end of the season. I'm really, really going to keep an open mind, and we'll come back to this next week and see if my newfound optimism has worked. So thank you again for, you know, kind of giving me a little space to ramble about my thoughts, because I think every week that comes on gets kind of slightly more chaotic, but I do really appreciate, you know, getting the chance to come and talk about each episode and discussing it with you, especially because I think a lot of the times we have very different opinions on a lot of things, so it's nice kind of having someone to talk about our differences with, talk about the things we feel the same about. And yeah, thank you very much.
No, that's all right. Listen, I'm always open to hearing some wrong opinions, and it just so happens you come ready with lots of them. But I'm very optimistic to hear that you're going to try and be nice to Halbrand. I'll believe it when I see it. And with that, thank you so much for listening. Cue the damn music. Thank you so much to Anna for once again joining me to break down this week's episode. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as we did recording. Let me know what you thought of our discussion on Twitter. Did the explosive ending to this episode live up to your expectations? Are you a believer that Halbrand is Sauron? And what are you most hoping to see in our final 2 episodes? I'd love to continue the discussion on Twitter, so come on over and join us. But for today, that's all we have time for. As always, I'd greatly appreciate if you could leave a rating or review on whichever podcast platform you use. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thank you so much for listening. I will hopefully be back this weekend with my review of episode 7 on the Daily Rings of Power podcast. Namarie.